Hi, I'm Metta Spencer, and I'm here in Toronto with a new friend, Matthew Hoffmann. I should say we're new friends because although I think both of us have been around the University of Toronto for many years, we were not really acquainted until now. I taught at the Mississauga campus, and he teaches quite a bit at the Scarborough campus, which made us about 40 miles apart. But then, of course, there is a St. George campus where everybody lives now and then. And Matthew Hoffmann is a political science professor with running something called the Environmental Governance Lab, which is, I gather, a component of the Monk School for Global Affairs. Do I have it right?
Yep, that's correct.
Excellent. And you do this with a colleague named Stephen Bernstein. Is that your...
Yep, and another colleague, Teresa Kramars. The three of us co-direct the lab.
And I haven't met her yet, and I want to because I saw something, looked like she had done something interesting. But
she does really great stuff.
That's super. Okay, and I hear that what you have been doing, you sent, I got your CV and looked at some of your work today, but didn't really have a chance to do it justice. I hear that what you are most interested in has to do with two things. You're doing climate change, and you're into looking at non-state actors and non-national or subnational state actors like cities, and their capacity for influencing global warming. And I think the other thing to do is look at at least that maybe that we'll talk about, is to look at the carbon pricing, how that can be done best. Because I think there's a lot there where I'm not up to speed on that. Okay. But let's start with cities, because this is an area, this series of conversations is sponsored jointly by Peace Magazine and a project Save the World, which is a bit ambitious, but we think everybody's trying to save the world from something, and I'm sure you're doing your part to save it from one of the worst catastrophes, global warming. So, and one of the things that we need a little filling in on is the role of cities and corporations, that is non-state actors, but also people like Jerry Brown in California, who have been taking the initiative in looking at ways in which municipalities and provinces and other subnational political entities can make a difference in terms of global warming. So let's start off by talking about that. You have a whole book on it. If you were giving a book pitch, which is about 10 years later, can you recall what you would have done if you were giving your first presentation of your book?
Yeah, sure. And actually, it's good because I think that fortunately that book has actually aged pretty well, and so I actually think it still has some things to say about what's going on today. The impetus for that book back in 2011 was I was writing in the time of really serious deadlock and gridlock really in the multilateral negotiations. And so the mid 2000s to the early 2010s was when basically no one had much hope in the way of what was going to happen with the United Nations. So this is pre-Paris. And so what I started looking at was the fact that even though there wasn't really much going on in the multilateral process, there was all kinds of activity amongst sub-state and non-state actors. So cities were taking actions, both individually coming up with city action plans for climate change, but also acting in concert. And so we saw the emergence of, and still functioning today, multiple transnational climate or city climate networks where cities were acting together and cooperating on climate change. So a range of corporations and NGOs actually cooperating on trying to deploy climate-friendly technology in multiple places, develop and deploy. So carbon markets, which were originally designed to work at the global level, so they were a key component of the 1997 Kyoto Protocol, But really, where they had some of their biggest inroads was in the subnational level. And so you saw provinces like Quebec and British Columbia take up carbon pricing relatively early. California.
When would that have been? What were the earliest versions of that?
The earliest versions of that at the subnational level was actually the cities in the northeast part of the United States. And so they formed a carbon pricing arrangement called RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which was a cap and trade system amongst those states, but focusing on electrical power generation. And I don't have off the top of my head, I think it was probably around 2004 when that launched. It launched soon after the EU launched their cap and trade system. And then not too long after that, although maybe 4 or 5 years, British Columbia came in with their carbon tax, and California came in with a cap and trade system a little bit after that. Quebec came up with theirs, and Quebec linked with California. And Ontario was linked to Quebec and Ontario, but we've pulled back from that in Ontario. And so I was really interested in how all of this kind of...
You just said something I want to explore. Ontario was linked and is no more. What happened? I must have blinked because I didn't see that come and go.
Well, Ontario, their cap and trade system went into effect last year, and then the linkage with the Quebec and California cap and trade system started January 1, 2018. And the linkage essentially meant that you could buy emissions credits in any of those jurisdictions to meet your obligations in those jurisdictions. And so if you're a company in California that had emissions reduction needs, you could buy the credits in Ontario. But when the Conservatives won the election, one of the first things that they did under the Ford government was to cancel the cap and trade system. And by canceling that, they essentially chopped off the linkage between Ontario, California, and Quebec.
Okay, sorry, but that's important for us all to know. I'm sorry that I don't.
Yeah.
Okay, onward.
And so excuse me, the work around subnational and private actors was to try and get a sense of where these things came from, but more importantly, what kind of politics do they generate, and what kind of response to climate change do they generate? Why is this kind of activity happening, and does it amount to anything? And so the book I wrote back in 2011 was really about where these things came from and how they function. And the research since then has been trying to figure out what kind of impact they might have, and go a little bit further on whether they can amount to anything. And in the interim, with the Paris Agreement, there's sort of been essentially reinvigorating of the multilateral or the global approach to climate change through the United Nations. But because that's very decentralized, right? The Paris Agreement relies on countries to come to their own commitments. It actually, and because there's a relatively large gap between what is necessary to keep warming to 2 or 1.5 degrees and what the countries have pledged, now the action on non-state and sub-state activity, or all the thinking on non-state and sub-state activity, is mostly around whether it can fill the gap between what states have pledged and what's necessary around 1.5. And so the politics and what kind of impact cities and provinces and corporations and NGOs can have is actually a pretty important topic these days at both the global level and for these kind of actors.
Yeah, well, I suppose the answer has a lot to do with what you said in the first place, whether you think this is an existential crisis or something that can be managed.
Yes.
If it's manageable, then maybe cities can do the job. But
well, I think that whether you think climate change is an existential crisis or a problem that can be managed really gets to the kind of urgency in what you consider to be radical action, not as much whether cities or subnational activity can have an impact. And because one of the things that we look at is how this kind of activity can be catalytic, that in fact global negotiations might be the wrong model for climate change because it doesn't really fit the problem structure very well. That we've essentially treated climate change for many years as a global collective action problem that was attempting to create a public good. And it turns out that acting on climate change that way really sets up an almost insoluble collective action problem. That by focusing only on emissions and focusing on interdependent commitments amongst countries is a way to not solve climate change. It's a way to get deadlock. And that one of the things that if you look at and take seriously all of the action amongst non-state actors and sub-state actors is it can be catalytic in multiple ways to generate momentum toward potentially, there's a lot of obstacles to it, but potentially to generate some momentum globally, even if it's not states acting cooperatively through the UN to do so.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember when a year or so ago when people were trying to say, how much can Trump do to shut things down? And I heard people say, well, not as much as he'd like, because it's quite possible for local polities to forge ahead on their own.
Yeah.
I don't know how far that could go. Certainly, well, please tell me how far you think it can go.
Well, I don't want to downplay how much damage the Trump administration is doing to U.S. climate, the momentum on climate action in the United States, because it's significant.
Yeah.
But that said, it's not as bad as it could be because cities and states are taking action. Right, California is the obviously big shining example of a very large portion of the U.S. economy that is moving on towards green energy. Or then California's essentially pledged to have 100% what they're calling clean energy, which is a mix of renewables and nuclear, by 2030. Mm-hmm. I think it was 2030. It's either 2030 or 2040. Mm-hmm. And so they're really moving quite far ahead. Now, the debate has always been is whether you eventually need nation states to take action. And that's probably true. Eventually, but where the debate is whether you need nation states to eventually come around and essentially ratify what everybody's already done, or if you need the federal governments, national governments, to be at the forefront. Obviously, it'd be better to have national governments aligned with subnational entities, subnational governments, and this is what you have in the EU for the most part, and that's one of the reasons they've been able to move so quickly. But in the absence of that alignment, subnational governments can do quite a bit precisely because there's a lot of reasons to act on climate change at the subnational and even at the municipal level that actually have nothing to do with climate change, right? And so,
like what?
Air pollution is a huge one. I mean, Ontario likes to tout, and rightly so, touts the coal phase out. Ontario got rid of coal-fired power. Mm-hmm. And this is touted as the single largest climate policy in North America.
Wow.
And that's true in terms of emissions. But historically, when you look at where that came from, is it was not a climate policy when it was first discussed. It was really pushed as a public health issue. Mm-hmm. And that's where a lot of the advocacy and a lot of the momentum around the coal-fired power phase out came from health. It did not come from climate. Mm-hmm. And so you can have what we talk about as co-benefits to acting on climate change, really driving policy at the local and provincial level. And so whether that's around livable cities, whether that's around employment and innovation, technological innovation, whether that's around pollution, whether that's around transportation issues, that you can really work on a lot of issues that have at least the potential for a significant impact on climate change without it being climate policy.
Yes, that's very interesting. And in fact, it fits with the kind of thing that the Project Save the World is mm-hmm. about. We're looking at all 6 major global threats and looking at the way they are interdependent. because all of these things, almost all of them fit together. Almost any major policy that you would come up with to solve one of these problems would help with one of the others, or several of the others. I guess the only exception being nuclear power, because the dispute, one of the things where we get hung up most has to do with whether nuclear energy is a salvation or a downfall.
Yeah, and that's something that hasn't been resolved amongst the environmental community. It certainly is not resolved amongst people that focus on climate change. And I'm wary of people that say there's no trade-offs. And so that's, if you get rid of nuclear, it's harder to get rid of fossil fuels. But whether that trade-off is worth it is the question.
Interesting. Elaborate. Yeah. Okay. Can you explain that?
Well, turning off the nuclear power plants, right, like Japan is doing, like Germany's doing, means that you have a relatively, because you can turn those off, like that. But I mean, it's not quite that simple, obviously, but you can turn them off relatively quickly. But then you have an immediate gap in your energy resources. And it's easiest to fill that gap in energy resources with existing fossil infrastructure, more so than it is with intermittent sources on renewable. And so you have to.
So are you saying that most people would say that automatically, if you shut down nuclear, you're going to have an increase of fossil fuel?
At least initially, because they're quicker to bring online and the infrastructure is there than renewables in most places.
Well, I guess that plays into, I'm leading you astray off topic in a way, but the whole question of the desirability of the pipelines in Canada, because I've just been reading the Globe and Mail today, and it talks about it as if, well, there's an interval there where we're going to be using fossil fuels no matter what, and we better have the pipelines to do it and make some money at it. So I guess the real question is, are there alternatives? And how quickly can the sustainable other sources come online?
Well,
if we really put our hearts and soul into it, how quickly could we?
Well, I'm not an energy economist, so I would hesitate to make predictions or say how fast we can bring renewables online. I mean, the pipeline issue is less about Canadian energy needs and more about selling oil abroad. And so there's sort of two different questions about, whether we need because the pipeline is to get oil to global markets.
Yeah.
Right. And so on the one hand, you could say, well, if we could take a Norway strategy, sell our oil on global markets and decarbonize our own society. Right. And this is essentially what Norway does, is they are actually quite far ahead on having moving towards momentum on a decarbonized society in Norway. I mean, highest electric vehicle use, all kinds of stuff on decarbonization there. But they're doing it by selling oil on the global markets, right? This is where they're getting a lot of the resources for it. So you could have an argument about that for pipelines. There is the argument that, yes, the world will have, in the medium term, still be using quite a bit of fossil fuels. The question for me on pipelines is always whether the pipelines are there to essentially get oil that we've already and will already have pumped to market, or are they there to expand the exploitation of the tar sands? And so to my mind, my take on this, I'm much more on the side of climate change. If it's not an existential threat already, it soon shall be. It's harder to justify from that perspective expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure. And certainly it's tough to justify expansion of exploitation of unconventional fuels. And so if the pipeline is there so that people are going to do more exploration and open up new oil fields in Alberta, that's problematic from a climate change as an existential threat perspective.
You bet. Yeah. Well, that's pretty much where I would agree. In fact, I would have said they shouldn't have even opened up the thing in the first place. The oil sands, should have left it in the ground.
Yeah. Well, but that gets at, I mean, since it's there and since it's being exploited, like if you want to start moving away from this, you got to really think carefully about a just transition away from fossil industry in Alberta. And this is what makes me the most disappointed is I don't think that we've spent as a country or in Alberta or as people even that just care about climate change, we haven't spent enough time thinking about how we can put policies and institutions in place so that people can see a future beyond the fossil fuels, beyond being dependent on the oil fields in Alberta for a large chunk of our economy.
Yeah, I haven't heard anybody talking about exactly that. You're right. And it sounds to me as if the whole thing is an operation in which you are creating assets that are going to be stranded assets before too long anyway, and multiply the problem, or at least, maybe you might push the economic catastrophe off from Alberta's future into another 10 years from now instead of now.
Yeah, and that's, well, certainly even Mark Carney, has warned about that from his seat at the now head of the Bank of England. He wrote some very influential papers about stranded carbon assets and the carbon bubble. And I think it's if the world gets serious, if demand plummets for oil, right? This is something that's a risk that I think the Canadian government, the Alberta government, and the companies that are in that sector need to really take probably more seriously than they have been.
Yeah, and now right now I think the oil price has declined recently, and I guess I don't know whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it yeah. You tell me what you think it is.
Well, it's one of those it's one of those it depends, right? One of the things that people that really cared about climate change wanted to see high oil prices, so that originally they wanted to see high oil prices so that renewable energy would be cost competitive. But now renewable energy is cost competitive at relatively low oil prices. And so some people are seeing low oil prices as a sign of lessening demand, which can be a good thing because it prices out unconventional oil. Now, on the flip side, that doesn't necessarily make for great politics, because the places where there's a lot of conventional oil are not necessarily the most stable, and so there's a whole, the political economy of oil gets very complicated very quickly, and I don't pretend to understand all of it.
Okay. I think I deflected you from your discussion about the ways in which subnational governments can be effective, and maybe we should go back to that, because I think there's a wealth of material there that needs to be discussed.
So we can take a look at that and and Stephen Bernstein and I do in our research, take a look at that sort of on two dimensions. You can ask whether they're effective in moving towards transformation in the cities themselves. So for instance, City of Toronto has a climate change plan. And so you can ask the question of, is this plan helping City of Toronto move towards lower emissions? Is it helping Toronto move towards decarbonization? Is it moving towards less reliance on fossil energy? I mean, all kinds of criteria. So you can look and evaluate the impact and say, are they effective just in the place where they're working? And so that's one level, right? We're actually a little more interested in whether they can have catalytic effects beyond where they're initially working. So does the City of Toronto's plan, and especially as over time, as there's budget now allocated to it, as they start to implement it, can it have catalytic effects beyond Toronto? And that's, if we want to talk about moving towards global transformation away from fossil energy and moving towards decarbonization and really getting at some of the root causes of this problem, we're going to need transformation at multiple levels and on multiple scales. And so we like to look at things like what the city of Toronto is doing and say, what kind of politics is it generating that could spread, right? And so, for instance, we had a PhD student named Laura Tozer who looked at redevelopment in the waterfront around the Pan Am Games. And so there was this really cool neighborhood that was redeveloped to be a pretty sustainable and low carbon neighborhood. And so this was a pilot neighborhood. And so we look at that's neat in and of itself, but globally, or even in Ontario, that doesn't really matter for our emissions. I mean, this is one neighborhood amongst, a very large city and a very populous province. But if you look at what pilot projects like it can do, is essentially they had to come up with new development and zoning regulations and new standards for buildings for this pilot. And so then you get developers and you get construction companies who are working at a new standard in that pilot project, developing new capacities, developing new skills for their trades, for their sectors, right, that can be applied elsewhere. And so this actually, in one sense, it builds the capacities developers and construction companies to build the low carbon infrastructure that we're going to need that can be transferred elsewhere to wherever else they're working. It also has the political impact potentially of now you've shown that this can be done and you can make it a good, prosperous neighborhood with these low carbon standards. And so it makes zoning discussions, it makes development standards, it makes discussions around building standards provincially, at least potentially different, right? That you now know that this can be done. It also means that you've changed what kind of political interests there are. So now you've got developers in construction that have all this knowledge and might want to be able to use it, and might even want to be able to get a premium for using those kind of skills, which are then suddenly allies for, at least potentially, none of this has happened. This is all potential pathways for how this impact could play out, but now could be supportive of more ratcheted up development standards around low carbon. Mm-hmm. We look at those kind of pathways where the actions in particular places at least have the potential to spread. And then we try and understand what might be the obstacles to them spreading, what might help them spread. And it's really fascinating work for us, but it's challenging because so many of these things are at the initial stages. Mm-hmm. And so it's not like we're studying things that have happened. We are trying to think about how things that are underway now might play out over time.
Okay, great. I remember when there was discussion about I think Trump was going to insist that there should be very loose standards for auto manufacturers in terms of energy efficient cars. Yeah. And California has its own very high standards, or I don't know how high, but higher. And I understand that the argument was that if California required that their cars in that state be higher level standards, then the auto manufacturers would have to live up to that.
Yep.
Just because California is such a big part of the U.S. economy that they couldn't afford to overlook it.
Yeah, they even call that the California effect in environmental policy. Yep.
Okay, there's a name for it.
Yeah.
Does that kind of thing play off in other situations where the market itself requires or creates a pressure for environmental improvement?
It certainly can. And I think that a number of NGOs are trying to find leverage points like that where you can use, and actually Paul Wapner, a political scientist at American University in Washington, D.C., has been writing about this kind of action for years, where you have civil society actors trying to find leverage points to get certain market actors to change in a way that you could get a sort of a large transformation from a relatively small change, right? And so the California effect around auto mileage standards is one of the big ones. And the latest thing with Trump is you're seeing that contestation. And in fact, a lot of US environmental policy, the way it works at the national level is states go out ahead of what the national level is ready to do. And then national regulations come in that are just a little bit not quite as far out as those states, right? And so you get these leading states driving environmental policy. But it also works at the private level. Some of that Paul Wapner's research talked about, the styrofoam battles in the 1980s, where the NGOs didn't go after every fast food company that was using styrofoam. They got McDonald's to change, and found this leverage point where you could get, a major corporation, target a major corporation, a major player in the sector to change. And then that would trigger and catalyze a change in the whole sector.
Why? I mean, what motivation would prompt, say, Tim Hortons to adopt it if McDonald's did?
Well, some of it is reputational. So if McDonald's changes, they're going to be touting their green credentials and say, green corporations don't use styrofoam and things like this. And so it changes there's at least attempts to change the reputation and public perceptions. Some of it is market dominance, that suddenly if you have a large player moving out of a particular kind of commodity, that can have market effects. But I think most of it is through reputation. You can get that kind of a change and then use the fact that McDonald's is competing with Tim Hortons and Burger King and all the rest of it. And they're always looking for an edge that can drive, those competitive pressures can drive a change.
Mm-hmm. Okay, can we talk about municipal things that can be done? Because as I was looking at your book, you had a list of things like, well, you talked about the lighting, for example, street lighting. And I think every one of us can think of ways in which we could suggest some improvements in our local neighborhood, Mm-hmm. I mean, what is this LED lighting? Yep. I mean, if a city decides to put in, I don't know, what would happen there? And another thing that I used to have a big fight with I'm in a condo, and I had a big fight with the managers because they had a big light outside my window. And I was insisting that the lamps should all have lids on them so that the light not go up into the sky, because it doesn't do any good, but be, shone down onto the ground where you probably do want somebody to be able to see what hole they're going to step into. And so I would, if I were in charge, I would put street lamps with lids on them. And I have a lot of other things. I have an innovation that everybody tells me is crackpot. And that is that when I went to a doctor and I was going someplace out in Etobicoke, and I had to turn right again and again to get there. And I got there in 20 minutes. And then I came home and I would have to turn left to get home. And it took me over an hour. Now, the reason is the left turns, they don't let you turn left. So I had to go miles and miles out of the way in order to get home. I have this theory that if they'd stop these damn left turns, and except where they're really needed, that people, you would save a lot of, carbon emissions.
That might be.
But I can't get anybody to think I make any sense, whatever they say. There's always a good reason for whatever traffic engineers do, of course.
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I'm not a traffic engineer.
And my young assistant yesterday came in with a new idea. He said there are all these planters and flower pots and boxes around the city, and they have annual, flowers, pansies and things like that growing in them, and they have to dig them up and all that. He said, why not put perennial plants there and absorb some of this CO2 and don't expose the dirt all the time to more, oxygen.
Yeah. And so there's a range of these kind of things, and we generally put, and I'm not a municipal politics scholar, and so, but you generally talk about that cities have two ways that they deal with climate change. One is in city operations, right? And so cities have control over their own vehicle fleets. Cities control a bunch of buildings, and so they can take action on the actual physical infrastructure that they directly control. And that can serve as a pilot projects. Those can serve as demonstration projects. And, you know, a number cities are often one of the larger landholders. The city governments are often usually one of the larger landholders in a city. And so changing city operations can have a significant impact. You can also, though, and this is the other side of this, is trying to change and decarbonize the city and reduce emissions in the city as an entity. And there's a mix of whether, and it varies from city to city, it varies from country to country in terms of how much authority cities have over what goes on in the city. As we learned in Toronto just this summer, you know, cities in Ontario do not have any actual legal existence. Which means that their authority to act on some of these things, you know, is at least contested in some cases. But so, for instance, when David Miller was mayor, he instituted a fairly large project to do building retrofits on public housing, right? So cities can do that kind of stuff. Cities can work on zoning, and they can work not so much on building codes. At least that is something that works in between cities and provinces and other governments. But there's work that the cities can do to try and deal with development codes and building codes and zoning, right? That can have a relatively large impact. They at least are in the discussion about transportation, right? If you remember, John Tory wanted to, but this is where the authority of the cities runs up against its limits. John Tory wanted to have congestion charges, and the provincial government said no. And so there's both opportunities and constraints given the nature of the city. Cities can also, though, work with neighborhood associations. And I think that this is something I hope we see more of, that you get sort of the sort of combination of local governments and grassroots activities working on these kind of things together. And that's, I think, where you start to see people envisioning what a low carbon city might look like. I thought that was one of the more innovative things that Toronto did over the last couple of years with the Transform TO project, that is essentially the city's climate and sustainability plan, is they did a lot of outreach with citizens. I went to at least one of the open houses or public forums they had, where they were really trying to get people to think about what a low carbon sustainable city would mean for them, and what would they want to see in it, and what's the good low carbon life look like for them. Colleague of mine, John Robinson, does a lot with this, trying to envision and have a large scale public input over envisioning what the sustainable city might be for people.
Well, how do real decisions get made? I live in a high rise, and the building next to me, they put up cladding on the outside of the building. It's brick, and they put up some kind of insulation, I think. That must be what it was, because there wasn't anything wrong with the building. They just, I don't think they were gluing it or something. I don't know, fixed it up. And so I never asked. They were renovating that apartment building, but now in my building, they say that one of these days they're going to change the thermostats so that we all pay our own heating bills, and that this is going to make us more mindful of when we're wasting energy. Which I think is a great idea. But how is it that the province would come in with a rule like that, or where would they get the idea they have to do that? And let's say that we took, nobody's done this, but let's say we decided to put a green roof or paint our roof white or something, where would the energy or the impetus for that kind of action come from most typically?
Oh, I don't know if there's an answer to that question, sort of where it comes from most typically. I mean, I think you see a range of incentives and motivations. So you might have Toronto Hydro or Ontario Hydro essentially giving incentives to do smart meters. I don't know if that's what's happening with your building or not. You could have you could have a city policy or a city project like David Miller put in place to do essentially building retrofits for making public housing more efficient. You could have, on the other hand, you could have people that live in a condo through condo associations sort of agree amongst themselves that this is what we'd like to see and put their resources towards it. Mm-hmm. And so all of that stuff that's going on, and especially in the building sector, is a mix of provincial and municipal incentives and regulations, and then motivations of the individual people that are living in and owning properties.
But normally I would assume that that building codes only apply for new buildings, right? You're not going to come along and say, you've got to renovate your building and make it more.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
And so, but and that's where you have more incentive programs to make your.
When I hear about this thing about glass being such a terrible insulation, and that they keep on building high-rise glass buildings.
Yeah, it drives my colleague Danny Harvey crazy to see all the glass. Danny Harvey is a climate scientist at U of T who knows more about the sort of technologies around decarbonization than anyone I've ever met, and all the glass in Toronto drives him nuts.
Oh. I know Danny, but I've never had that conversation with him. I'll have to ask him, because he's the guy who insisted that we have a plank in our platform for survival about requiring that nations develop dietary guidelines which take into consideration environmental factors when they pick what foods people should eat. Yeah. Well, I think that's a very idealistic notion, because I don't know anybody who would pay the slightest attention to their nation's dietary guidelines when deciding what to have for dinner. Do you?
I don't know, but what it points to is this just sort of how much or how integrated carbon and climate is into all aspects of our lives. And this is something I try and get across to my students about exactly. Climate change isn't a single problem. It is a sort of a family of problems that are related to how carbon is embedded in almost everything that everyone does.
Yeah.
Almost every economic activity you can imagine, every agricultural activity is tied back to carbon, and the embeddedness of that is why it's such a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Tell me, let's talk about this carbon pricing business, because although I am a tremendous believer in carbon taxation, I don't understand cap and trade. Okay. And I just don't know how it works or why it would be considered at all equal in its value. I would think the logical thing is you just charge everybody a certain amount for whatever they're buying, and the costs would just take care of themselves. Why would a cap and trade system with all of that bureaucracy be more desirable?
Well, we can talk about that but at the outset, I would note that functionally, and it depends on how it's designed, but functionally, cap and trade and carbon taxes are the same, because they're both mechanisms, and depending on how they're designed, they put the same price on carbon.
Well, do they really? Or is it that they, in theory, should? If you actually look at what the effects are, do they have the same effects empirically?
Well, we have only a couple of each is the problem. And so much of whether they have the same effects depends on how they're designed. It doesn't have anything to do with the inherent logic in cap and trade versus carbon taxes. It's entirely about how they're designed.
Okay.
And so the trade-offs between them, the sort of simplest way to talk about the trade-offs between them is, with carbon taxation, you are controlling the price, but you're not controlling the quantity of emissions reduced, right? And so you put a tax on carbon, and then through the market and through increased prices, you will see potentially a reduction or not. And that depends the reduction that you see depends on the price you set it at, the elasticity of demand for the products that are carbon intensive, and also the kind of coverage that you do for the tax, what kind of breaks you give and things along those lines, right? For cap and trade, you're controlling the amount of carbon dioxide. You're controlling the emissions because you're setting a cap over whatever system you're regulating, whether it's the state, the whole province of Ontario, or whether it's just the electric generation sector. You're setting a cap on the emissions, but you're not controlling the price. You're letting the market determine the price, right? And so, but again, depending on how they're designed, the logic of those does not, one isn't better than the other in terms of getting a price on carbon. The arguments for cap and trade are usually that, one, it is easy. People say it's easier politically, although that has gone up and down, right? Mm-hmm. Because of how allergic people are to the notion of a tax. Some people argue that cap and trade is better because it is more, frankly, more hidden. That you don't see a carbon tax right on things. And some people also say that the revenue that it raises is more easily used in the cap and trade system because you are essentially, the polluter is paying, even though they pass those costs along. I don't pay the carbon tax. I don't pay for the emissions allowances in a cap and trade system. The people that are doing the polluting pay for those. They pass those costs along, so it's functionally the same, right? But what the government is essentially charging the polluters to pollute. And so recycling that revenue into public transportation, into catalyzing renewable energy, is seen as politically easier by some, right? And so
do you believe
most of the I'm actually agnostic. I'm very pragmatic when it comes to carbon pricing. I think that the thing we need to do is get at least some pricing on carbon that will survive elections. And I think it's going to vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction what's going to the characteristics of the carbon pricing system that will survive elections.
Well, it should be easier logically, and I guess the question is, in fact, is it easier to pass a carbon taxation or carbon pricing scheme if you promise that you're just going to give the money right back? In other words, yep, we're not even going to keep the money and use it for anything else. We'll give it right back to the public. And all we want to do is make sure that they're paying for the amount of carbon they're emitting.
In theory, that's true. And I think the Trudeau government is putting a pretty big bet that that's going to be true, because I think that we're going to actually fight an election over climate change in a way that we've never done before.
Really?
Yeah, I think that it's going to be a huge issue in the 2019 election. Public opinion polls muddy that conclusion a little bit. They say the most popular and most support in public opinion polls. Now, these are always hypothetical rather than about the actual results of a carbon pricing scheme. But public opinion polls show that for the most part, people are most supportive of carbon pricing schemes that plunge the money into public goods, especially around things that would enhance the action around climate change. So public transportation, renewable energy, things for low income people, but not just a straight rebate. But we're gonna test. We're in the midst of an experiment with the federal carbon pricing scheme.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of public opinion, I don't know where it's going, but excuse me. There have been two. I think one was yesterday, as some sort of big public announcement, a scary story, and one was early October that the IPCC came out and said you've got to keep it under 1.5 degrees and not the 2.2 degrees that had been pegged before. And both of them, as I understand it, have said there's going to be a real heavy cost. That if you're thinking in terms of economics, the best advice is spend the money now and clean it up and fix it.
Yeah,
because it's going to cost you a hell of a lot more in the long run if you don't.
Yep.
And I don't know how far that is going. It doesn't seem to impress the climate skeptics. Not that I even know any personally. I don't even have this conversation because all of my friends agree with me. But do you even know anybody who reasonably or logically? I only know one. Yes, I do know one guy who I won't name, but he is a great believer that that the whole thing is overblown. But only one guy. The rest of them all seem to have the position which I have, which is, my God, this is really an emergency. Let's get on with it.
Yeah. Yeah. But so the economic cost argument that we're going to pay more for and the costs of climate change are going to far exceed the costs of trying to stop climate change over the long run. That doesn't, first of all, that doesn't get at the skeptics, because skeptics they're thinking about whether it's real or not. Now, whether that's motivated reasoning or a lack of trust in scientific authority, there's all kinds of hypotheses about why people are skeptics.
Well, have you talked to any? Do you know any of these folks, and do you understand how they reason? I really, honestly, it's a dumb question, but it is my real question. Is I simply don't know.
I don't interact much with climate skeptics other than on Twitter. I don't have any personal friends that are climate skeptics, so I'm relying on sort of studies of climate skepticism when I look at that.
Okay.
And like I said, some of the people point to motivated reasoning, that if you are heavily invested in the fossil economy, you are more likely to see that what you're doing is not having damaging effects. There's a general growing lack of trust in scientific authority.
Is that growing?
According to some studies I've seen, yeah.
Very strange.
Yeah.
Very strange.
But the economic cost argument, so that probably motivates people. And so I think that there's a couple of different segments of the population. There's the skeptics who say it's not a real problem. Then there's those that say, well, it's a problem, but then think about whether it's a manageable problem, and then therefore think about trade-offs and economic costs. And then there's those that think it's a existential threat, and so that changes our entire idea. What counts as radical, and we need to act now quickly, and economic costs are less, or certainly the economic costs of damage are the ones they pay attention to, rather than the economic costs of acting on climate change. And we always run into the problem with even these estimates of how much climate damage is going to cost us. Even though the IPCC reports have moved up those dates, so we're going to start to see we're already seeing major costs from climate change. The real catastrophe.
All those fires in California can't have been cheap. Somebody's paying a lot of money for that.
And what might change the game is when people are now seeing costs from impacts now, because for the first 15, 20 years, the difficulty was that the costs from climate change were always something off in the future. And so we weren't going to pay those costs. And so it's hard to get really a lot of political momentum around fixing a problem that the costs would be if we have to pay those costs today, but the benefits are for people decades and decades away. But now, I think that the California fires, the British Columbia fires, the more damaging, not more hurricanes, but more damaging hurricanes that we have, the changes in precipitation, but we're starting to see the effects in a real tangible way that we hadn't seen before. And I don't think this is a hope. I'd rather not see these catastrophes, but it's getting harder and harder and more ridiculous for the climate skeptics to dismiss the catastrophes that we're seeing. Right? They are becoming the things that they're saying are becoming more and more ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. Okay, got it. There's one. I have a couple of hobby horses that and one of them has to do with refrigeration. I don't know whether you've read Paul Hawkins' book Drawdown, but he has a list. It's an amazing book. You ought to look at it. It's really quite an interesting book, and he has a list of 100 or so things that you can do to minimize global warming. And he kind of rank orders them in terms of effectiveness. And the top thing at the very top of the list is refrigeration. And he was totally baffled by it, and nobody expected it. And it was very, and then additional research on this, I've read an estimate that refrigeration can cause up to 1 full degree of centigrade of global warming. That will make account for that.
Or just refrigeration for food?
Refrigeration, it's the coolants that are used in air conditioners and refrigerators. Because they replaced that, when they had the Montreal Protocol, they replaced that for the ozone. But in fact, what they put in there is even worse for CO2.
Yep.
And it's like thousands of times worse than other kinds of, regular emissions, much worse. And what I would love to see and this could even be done on a, Ontario basis or even maybe Toronto basis, a law that whenever a company delivers a new refrigerator or a new air conditioner, that they have to take away the old one and take it to a place where they have experts who can take out that coolant. Because otherwise, if they're going to take it to the city dump or wherever they do these things, all of that, those gases are going to get off into the atmosphere. And that is where it's really dangerous, because they've got a new protocol that came in Kigali, in Rwanda recently, where they're going to have to change to the different kind of coolant, which isn't as good, isn't as effective, but it's much, much safer. And but that's going to be for new refrigerators and new air conditioners. And in the meantime, we have all these air conditioners that are going to be leaking this stuff. And I think we need to get on to getting that stuff out of there and saving it.
Yeah, I think you could, that's absolutely correct. And I think you can point to it. There's a lot of what we call low hanging fruit like that. Fugitive methane emissions is another one. Black soot is another one. There's a number of things where there's no real opposition to acting, but we just need to get some of these things in place.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, what would you, if you were able to pass one new law, and what would your new law be? And you could apply it, let's say throughout Canada. What would your one most effective and promising legislation be?
I would work on climate change by trying to, I don't know if this would be a law or what, but building resilient communities would be what I would focus on.
How?
Job training. I would focus on designing and helping and having people participate designing livable cities. I see. My take on this is that we really need to get at some of the root causes of this, and we need to work on the foundations of the low carbon future. What is work going to look like in the low carbon future? Because we need to get some serious buy-in across economic sectors. We need to get serious buy-in across the population to do some of these large-scale transformations. And we don't have enough of the institutions and social capacity and social capital for people to feel comfortable about the kind of transformations that we're undertaking. That's where I would work. That's not a law. I mean, the easy answer is to say I'd get, the national carbon price going and ratchet it up. But then I don't want to see that kind of climate policy in isolation. I want us to really take seriously that we have to transform our societies and economies in significant ways to really deal with climate change on a serious level.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it is exactly 9 o'clock.
All right.
And you have done the mission that I asked you to do. You've explained life to us and all about how to make our cities and subnational governments. We haven't talked much about corporations, though. So next time we'll have to talk about that.
All right. My pleasure.
This has been a delight, and I've enjoyed it very much. And I'll send you the link when we get this done.
All right. Please do.
Fine. Take care, Matt.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.